One of the things we wanted to do this year was better communicate the things we do on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. The most important thing we do is provide learning settings for the students. That's our job and that's our goal. So we want to make sure that what we're doing is communicating you frequently, either monthly or bi-monthly in some manner, the things that we're doing. And so this is just a little snapshot. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Month before last, we went over our assessments, so the ISAT and NWA assessments. And so today, we're going to take a look at our power standards and grades for our first quarter. And so we've been looking at that from in our grade levels as we meet, and so we're just going to give you an overview of that, what that looks like. It's just, I'm going to back up for a second and tell you what power standards, clarify for you what power standards are. And probably 4 years ago, we, in conjunction with the multi-district work that we did, identified the need for really communicating 8th grade through the freshman year, so that our curriculum was more in line with where we want our kids to be in 12th grade, so that it was flowing all the way through. And so in doing that, looking at that, there were some gaps and there were some things that were not being addressed, and so it drove the direction of learning and in-servicing it onto what are the most important skills, what are the basic levels of each grade level in reading, math in particular, for every grade, so that we could get them to that K-12 or to that 12th grade graduation and moving on to post-secondary learning. So that's where power standards came to be. So what we did was we took all the state standards and identified in the grade levels what were the key standards essential for that grade. What the grade levels we called it own it. They would own multiplication. They would own the idea that in this grade level it's critical for you to do this. Now, you'll see power standards and grades, and in some ways they don't necessarily relate real consistently with one another, because our grades encompass all the things that we teach and learn. Our power standards are just those very specific skills, very specific expectations for the students. And so if a child perhaps didn't do well in reading for the quarter, maybe they got a C or maybe they got a D or whatever, they potentially could have mastered or handled the power standards for the term in reading and math, have those things. Maybe there's some other things that aren't being covered, and maybe they didn't. But what we commit ourselves to with power standards is if a student doesn't master it when we assess it, that we don't let go of it, that we keep after them for those things that we've identified as essential learning and essential learning targets for the students until they get it. So in some ways, when you give a grade, the quarter's over, you start the new quarter, you start fresh, here we go again. When it comes to power standards, we don't start all over. We keep working at it, figure out, we intervene, we RTIs, something you've heard before, a response to intervention. So students that haven't mastered it when we would have expected them to when we give the assessment for the class are then receiving additional support and intervention until they get it. And so that's, they coordinate in a lot of ways, but it's our commitment to the kids and to the learning for the kids that when they finish the grade level in those areas, that they're secure in those skills so that they can be successful at the next level. So that's kind of power standards, what that means. Along with the power standard, in the higher you go at the middle school, oftentimes they all of the students in 6th grade have the same teacher, or all of the, or in math, although 67 kids that are in the grade level all have the same teacher for math. Well, in the lower levels, you know, that doesn't exist. They could have two or three different teachers And so therefore what we do is make sure that we have the same assessment. Every kid is assessed in the same way so that we could make sure that that was fair and consistent as well. So looking at our data, so we look at our data this quarter. At the bottom there you can see this is reading. Our kindergarten students don't get grades, letter grades. We start letter grades in first grade. Their kindergarten grades look more like, well, test and use, but it's more skill-based, community skills. And so I don't have grades included on that piece for kindergarten. Anyway, so as you take a look at the reading here, I met with third grade today, and we talked about, so 59% of our students in third grade are above average, is what our grades are telling us. Okay, and we have 11% of our students that are performing below average in third grade. And so we just looked at it, we talked about it, we asked ourselves, does that reflect the daily practice in your room? Is that what it looks like? Then we looked down, then we moved down and we looked at the standards so far. If you see that first column, well, second column, but the number of standards assessed so far. So in the primary or elementary, we've assessed anywhere from 2 to 4 by the end of the quarter of the power standards. And so the percentages, so when I say number 1, 2, 3, well, it's an arbitrary number there. It means something to me, does it? So for the most part, when they're given their assessment, the majority of the kids should have it. If I'm ready to assess and I'm ready to give this to the students, they've received lots of instruction on it, they've practiced it a bunch, and should be relatively successful. So as I look at this reading one here, it's only alarming to me in second grade. And in second grade, it's very alarming to me that, okay, after given instruction in those 3 power standards, I mean, wow, we're still struggling a whole bunch with some things. So we're still going at it, but it's a community, that's my indicator to say, okay, I want to take a look at that in second grade and see what's going on, what are the kids, is there something that maybe they didn't walk in the door with? The second, and really didn't have some prerequisite skills. So it's just conversation. It isn't necessarily an evaluation. This is just to help us communicate, try to figure out what's happening and what we're doing with that. That's really probably, if you look at the percentages of students in reading in first grade in the below average, that's a higher number probably. I mean, if you compare to the other grade levels. But it's also first grade, so it doesn't really surprise me. It's the first quarter, so that also doesn't surprise me. It's a big transition and lots of demands coming on for those kids, and perhaps not really developmentally ready to do some of those things yet. All right, and the next slide is math, and you'll see that in terms of our grades are much higher in math than they were in reading. We were closer in like between 52 and 59% in reading in the above average component. In math, it's in the 60s. So our students are performing better in math than they are in terms of their grades. And then if you look at our power standards are better. My second grade is kind of confusing. All of them had 1 assessed, and a number of them had number 3 and number 4, but they didn't all have it, so it's hard for me to put all the data together to make it make sense. But again, it's a communication tool here. When I'm looking at when we're in the 90s, we're probably talking about 1 student. If it's in the 1 or maybe 2 students that aren't proficient in that. And you look at it and you think, well, why does 4th grade have 7 power standards already assessed in this first quarter? They have, in their first 2 units, they have, it's geometry. And so there are a number of specific skills that they have to master in their standards. So it covers, the first unit, I think, covers 4 or 5 of their power standards for the year. And so one of the things, and Ted will speak to it in a minute, of the difference the elementary is a little bit different from the middle school in the way that they break down their power standards into specific descriptors, which means they have more. Then you'll see ours average in a year's time from 8 to 12 in reading, and in math from about 10, well, no, not 10, probably 12 to 16, 12 to 18 or so total power standards for the grade level. And even that number is pretty high in terms of really grabbing onto it and committing ourselves to that. All right, if you go on to the next, we don't have, our power standards are driven in the reading and math, so our language really kind of are encompassed in the reading, but we do give a different grade, or give a grade. Language arts is represented in the skills of spelling, composition, and grammar, so that's what makes up our language arts grade. And again, it mirrors pretty similarly to our reading language arts. Although pretty different skills really in terms of what we're using in the assessment. Nothing here really stood out necessarily. In science here, you'll see first grade we don't give a letter grade, we give S or N or U, and so that's what it looked like there. You'll see in the next slide that our science grades compared to our social studies grades are very different. If I would have been guessing, I probably would have flip-flopped, which I believe is harder. I mean, science grades are much higher than our social studies grades. We talked about that today for third grade, and talked about a lot of the approach to science instruction is observation and experimentation in the scientific process, and lots of it is done in group and in a practice manner that way. It isn't super fact-driven, it's more the process of science than it is a lot of the nitty-gritty facts of science. Not that they do have that, but the approach is investigative and a part of the scientific method process. And so we talked about that as being something, just making ourselves aware of that and knowing that maybe not preparing. In some ways, it prepares. It's amazing when you have someone observe and really learn how to observe. It's very difficult. They don't do that. To really take a look and then take the time to observe. I think as we started to use this science series probably 4 or 5 years ago, we really found out how we didn't have them do that and record the data based on their observations. So we do that better, but maybe our facts and our information need a little more balance. I'm not sure. That was just some initial conversation. So here's our social studies, and as I said, there's a bigger percentage. It's more fact-driven. So social studies curriculum is more fact-driven and practice-driven, and again, something we talked about or being able to talk about. Oh, you're up.
I'm up.
Any questions on that?
What I was after you guys, 2 months ago, I think, we went through and went fast because they're supposed to the test data. And the test data tells you the amount of information the students have. When we're looking at grades and power standards, you're looking at the information they have, the performance. So we have to, the teachers have to, they're looking at the kinds of things the kids know, but then we'll have students who know a lot, because they don't get the support at home, don't do as much. And so this shows you more what they do. And we have to be looking at both what they know and then what they're doing with it, because both of those parts are critical for the teachers in order to be successful with our students. So this is much more about the do, but it requires some know, obviously, to be able to do it. But it gives you a sense of what the students are doing. They're doing their homework. They're getting stuff done. Are they using the information they have? Mr. Brooks.
So, echoing a lot of what Pat said, that we're very similar. We all started the process with power standards about 4 years ago. Because teachers here primarily teach one subject, we were able to finish up ours a little earlier on in it. And then as we were using them, we found a difficulty that, say in math, you have out of those, say 10 to 12, 13 standards, one standard would cover multiple things. So can you do, double-digit addition and, use percentages and things like that might all be covered in one single standard. And so I was asking the teachers, well, can the kid do the standard? And they're like, well, he can do part of the standard. And so then we, as a staff together, made the decision to divide those down into what's known as a descriptor. So it's, again, we all kind of started with the same, 8 to 12, 16 power standards. And then in most of our areas here at the middle school, we've broken it down. So for instance, Pat, you've got what, 57 in Algebra 1 or 55?
I have no idea.
She has a lot. It's a ginormous number. Again, same sort of base of information that the K4 and some of the K5 are working with, but just broken down a whole lot more. So when you see some of the numbers, for instance, having covered 7 and 8 of those, it's not like we got the whole year done already this quarter. So grade wise, so language arts, again, in language arts does encompass both language arts and reading. When we look at the power standards, we don't break those apart specifically to those areas. And in this case, I was able to kind of take out as each of the 8 standards because there was enough that I put them down kind of in a similar order as Pat did. So you can see that some of them they've got at 100% level, some of them only 73% of the class has it. And you're like, okay, so Ted, how do you track 50 some power standards and keep all this stuff as teachers in your head? This is the sheet that we kind of use. It's actually a spreadsheet and there's like 3 pages to it. And we all refer to them as our red, yellow, green sheets. But they're our progress monitoring kind of per student. And as the teacher does whatever it is that they are considering an assessment, a mastery level assessment of this descriptor, then they're going to go to these sheets and they'll click on it, and if it's red, that means they don't have it. If it's yellow, that means that they're kind of progressing in it, so usually that's somebody in the 75 to 80 percentile, 70 to 85%, that they're okay, they've got some idea, but we really want to see 85% or higher, really 90% is what we would prefer, and those guys get green. And I've kind of developed this thing, I'm going to market it, I think someday and make $1 million. But when you click on it for 1, 2, or 3, it will turn it the different colors. And what's really helpful for this, as we get towards the end of the year, it's very easy for the teachers to go through and say, okay, well, here's what I've covered, here's what I haven't covered. Here's, this standard 2B is one that I got a lot of kids in the yellow. That means I need to go back and cover it some more. If they're almost all green and then there's only like 1 or 2 kids that are yellow or red, that helps us to identify them in the RTI process that we talked about, meaning, I think that pretty much the whole rest of the class has got this thing. Now I need to go back and just deal with that 1 or 2 individual kids, and I might be giving them just a little bit extra worksheets or homework to work on, a little bit of tutoring, might work with an aide. We use our exploratory time a bunch. Again, Carrie Nottingham found a free program called 10 Marks about a month or 2 ago. That's a math tutoring help one, and Pat Wallace has done a great job taking her kids that she looked and go, okay, who's my red and yellow kids in the areas that I expect to have pretty much mastered it, and identified it and matched those up, and then she's had those kids in working with Irina Stan, actually in our exploratory time in the computer lab through this computer program, and you've had, and Heather, I'm sorry, want to give Heather credit too. And it's been really kind of cool because like every couple days I'll get an email from Pat, Lexi graduated today, woohoo, and then they get to go and pick another exploratory or something else. So it's a process that we're still developing and figuring out, but it's coming together, and I think the teachers will say it's a lot of work, but it makes sense to them in terms of where they're at. It also, there's kind of a vertical look at it, meaning, okay, so which standards, descriptors have I not done well, and I need to teach whole group versus small, and then I also can look across, and I can have a kid, as I look across this thing, that kid's got a lot more red and yellow than the other kids on there, and so I know that kid's really struggling in kind of a global manner that I need to work with them more. So, so that's kind of the process that we go through in terms of how do we figure out, the descriptors and how kids are doing on them. Again, reading, they're included in the language arts, and then, like Pat, you know, very similar kind of numbers that we're seeing in that 50 to 60 kind of range of kids that we feel are doing really well, those kind of in the middle, and then down around that 20% level that are struggling down at the bottom of that. In math, again, there's a ton of descriptors. So in 7th and 8th grade, for instance, we're seeing that we're at 12 and 13 descriptors right now. Last year, when we first, or 2 years ago, I think when I started looking at this, and the first time I did it, I said what percentage of descriptors had you finished for the year. So if there's 52 descriptors and you finished 12, you've done 22% or something of your descriptors. And initially, it was very shocking because the first quarter, we were like, whoa, I'm way behind. What we found was we do a lot of laying a foundation in the early part of the year, and then running this, and she was kind of scaring me for a little while because she would have like 2 descriptors done or whatever, like, Ronnie, you got 40 to go, how's it going? And then all of a sudden, at the end of second, and particularly in the third quarter, she's really wrapping up a lot of that foundation work and testing the kids at that point. So we do kind of look at that, particularly in terms of reading, we see that. Math is paced a little bit more, but again, early in the year, we tend not to see as many of them done, and then in the second quarter, and definitely in the third quarter, we see a bunch. In fact, at the end of the third quarter, I really want to see more than 75% done, and that's another helpful part of this process is pacing-wise, because you really should be over 75%, because let's face it, that last quarter, the last month is a little hairy, and what I really want to be doing that last month is catching up all those kids that are still yellow and red, and I want everybody else to be pretty much green, and we're going to do some enrichment and catch some things that are not necessarily so critical to my curriculum. So, at the end of the third quarter, I'd like to see more like 85% of your descriptors that you've got the majority of your kids having mastered at that point. Well, I did different because we had 13, and I didn't want to, like, 13 columns was going to get crazy. So I kind of looked at what percentage of the kids here were 85 to 100% had mastered it. So 8th grade will take six of them there. So real solidly, we've got 6 the standards covered. 4 were progressing along, and 3 of them, I'd say, introduced, but certainly something that we're going to go back and cover a whole lot more as time goes on. Science, same kind of look again. A lot of science. When we think of how are you checking to know if they have these descriptors, many times we're talking a test quite often. Science and some of the others, but science in particular is one where it's much more project-based in terms of the science fair project. So I'm not sure exactly how many, but probably 15 out of the 40 descriptors are very specific to science fair in some way or another, talking about research writing and talking about can you form a hypothesis and can you test it and you understand the scientific method and procedures and safety procedures and things like that. All of those things get tested very much in science fair. So we see a pretty big explosion at the end of the second quarter of our descriptors being covered because science fair is such a big portion of, especially the second quarter, we really get that final assessment.